I'm Professor Dwyer in the theology department, and I am helping facilitate a 3-part series on the history and mission in Thomas More. And the goal is just to help us grow as a community and an understanding of our history and mission so we can better live it out. So in session 1, we focused on the history of Thomas More, and today we're going to pivot to talk more about the mission of Thomas More University. And I'm sure you've all probably heard it a million times, but I'm just going to go ahead and read it once more so we're all on the same page here. Thomas More University is the Catholic liberal arts university of the Diocese of Covington, Kentucky. Inspired by the Catholic intellectual tradition, we challenge students of all faiths to examine the ultimate meaning of life, their place in the world, and their responsibility to others. Okay, so today we're going to be focusing on two aspects of our Catholic mission. Dr. Brad Bursa is going to talk about Catholic social teaching and how that really sheds light on the second part of our mission, examining the ultimate meaning of life, our place in the world, and our responsibility to others. The Catholic social teaching is part of the Catholic intellectual tradition, and it shapes both our curriculum and some of our extracurricular offerings here as well. So he's going to help us better understand that.
Okay, so as Caitlin mentioned, my name's Brad. I'm currently the Director of Evangelization at St. Gertrude Church in Cincinnati. Most of my experience in the church, in my professional career, is in parish ministry. I have worked for the Archdiocese of Cincinnati as well. So when it comes to talking about Catholic social teaching, this is certainly an area that has touched my life. I grew up Catholic and was in Catholic schools my whole life. So I've learned Catholic social teaching, but actually having the chance to teach it has really been my first real entry into the subject in a real, in-depth study, as a real in-depth study. So let's just begin. What is Catholic social teaching? A few points here. I need to move everyone's pictures. Okay, there we go. So I would say this: it's the church's body of doctrine. So these are teachings that are handed on over time, part of this intellectual tradition that Father Twaddell was talking about, that pertain to how one ought to love his or her neighbor socially. Okay, so we're very much in the realm of the greatest commandment, love of God and love of neighbor. And this line of doctrine specifically has to do with love of neighbor, and even more specifically, how we would love our neighbor socially. So there's a great quote from the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church that gets at this. It says, "In so many aspects, the neighbor to be loved is found in society." Okay, so we never find the neighbor in isolation, but always as a member of a social network or multiple social networks. So we find the neighbor in society, such that to love him concretely, assist him in his needs or in his indigence, may mean something different than what it means on the mere level of relationships between individuals. To love him on the social level means, depending on the situations, to make use of social mediations to improve his life or to remove social factors that cause his indigence. Now, last semester in the spring, I was reading this and trying to think about how I could just communicate this more easily to my students. And I was eating Jimmy John's at the time when this analogy popped into my mind. So I have a great image of Jimmy John's sandwich, because if you haven't eaten lunch yet, you're probably very hungry. This will add to your hunger. But I was sitting there eating my sandwich, and I was just thinking, the church is really a mother to us. This is how we come to understand the Catholic Church, as a mother. And If a mother has a child, and this is where Jimmy comes in, so let's say her child's name is Jimmy. Jimmy's at school, and this particular day, Jimmy's lunch gets stolen by a bully, and he gets beaten up on the playground. And Jimmy comes home, and he's very upset. And like all good mothers, she knows that something's wrong. And so she asks him, and then the tears flow, and the story comes out. Well, what's this mother going to do for her son, for Jimmy? Well, she's going to take care of his immediate need, which is probably hunger because his lunch was stolen. And maybe she has to take care of a few wounds, scrapes and bumps and bruises. And she's going to also take care of his emotional needs, hear his story, console him, and so forth. But a mother's love in a case like this is not going to stop just with Jimmy. It's going to spill out into the social environment wherein various injustices took place. So what's she going to do? Well, she's going to probably get a hold of the teacher, find out if the teacher knows what happened. Maybe she'll have a conversation with the parents of, the bully or the bullies. If the teacher's non-responsive to the situation, she might work her way up the chain, talking to the vice principal or the principal, right? And this is just kind of like a very common situation wherein one's neighbor is loved not just in immediate needs, not as an individual, but the social environment must also be impacted in order for this child to be in the right kind of environment for education to take place, and so on and so forth. Now, with my students, I talk about how Catholic social teaching, first and foremost, has to do with how Catholics ought to treat one another. But it spills out beyond that and is a real invitation for the good of all of society. And so I talk about how any good mother, if she was walking through the hallway and saw one of Jimmy's friends, she saw Johnny, who's not her own child. She saw Johnny, laying in a heap because he also was the victim of some sort of bullying. She's going to act the same way, I'm assuming. I can think of my own mother. She would take care of Johnny, but then also work to impact the social environment, the social structure as well. So for me, this is just a very simple way that I like to think about it in order to wrap my mind around what Catholic social teaching is getting at. Now, this body of doctrine has developed over a long period of time. And so here I'm going to pull a Father Twaddell and start to take us back just briefly. Oftentimes, you might hear of Catholic social teaching as kind of conceived as something of a modern development, beginning in 1891 with Pope Leo XIII's Rerum Novarum. And the advantage of this kind of approach when we just study, modern encyclicals from recent popes and so forth, is we really see how this teaching comes into contact with contemporary issues and how this aspect of the Catholic intellectual tradition can really speak into what we're seeing play out in society. The obvious disadvantage, though, is that we kind of we lose out on many, many centuries of how these teachings have developed. And so things can maybe get too simple or too political, and we kind of miss some of the point. So what I'd really like to emphasize is that Catholic social teaching, its basis is not in ethics or sociology, but really in faith in the God of revelation. It is a form of theology. It is a form of theology, and even more specifically, a form of moral theology. Right? And we always remember that the Church's teaching is an evangelical manifestation of the great dignity of human nature and the wonder of God's work in the world. Okay, so by taking the long view, we can situate Catholic social teaching in the right way and avoid that tendency for the church to become an NGO or be seen as an NGO or social service organization. So how does this develop? Well, like Father Twaddell pointed out with Catholic intellectual tradition, it really begins before the church. And so we see the first insights in this social teaching within the book of Exodus and the liberation of the Israelites from Egypt. We know that the Hebrews were forced into slave labor. Eventually, it leads into the destruction of human life, where the Egyptians are killing Hebrew boys. And then we have that call of Moses. Moses is to lead the people 3 days journey out into the wilderness to offer sacrifice to the Lord. What we see here is that the human person is really most complete and most free when the human person is in relation to God, the God who created him. So freedom is this contextual experience of right order and a true orientation to the source and origin of existence. Freedom, sure, it involves freedom from oppression, but its deeper task is really the restoration of meaning and purpose of human life and experience that is found in relation to God. So we have this story of the Exodus account, and then we hear, as the Old Testament goes on, we hear about the Anawim, the little ones, these ones of particular favor of the Lord, who are particularly close to the heart of the Lord during the Babylonian exile. They're the poor ones who are the first who are invited back as Jerusalem is restored. And then we make our way into the New Testament, and we know many, many stories in the Gospels of Jesus being close to the poor, to the needy, to the sick, to the sinful. So the poor and the needy have a particularly close place to the heart of God. Jesus in Matthew's Gospel, he says, "I bless you, Father, Lord of heaven and of earth, for hiding these things from the learned and clever and revealing them to mere children." So we have this emphasis in the Gospels placed on humble service to the poor, to the needy, to the disadvantaged. We continue our journey through history. We hear in Acts chapter 4 this description of how the church cares for one another, how members of the church care for one another. It says this: "The community of believers was of one heart and mind, and no one claimed that any of his possessions was his own, but they had everything in common. With great power, the apostles bore witness to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and great favor was accorded to them all. There was no needy person among them. For those who owned property or houses would sell them and bring the proceeds of the sale and put them at the feet of the apostles, and they were distributed to each according to his need." So we have, during this time immediately after the ascension of the Lord, when the early members of the early church were awaiting his second coming that they anticipated to be very soon, we have this kind of very intense experience of the communal life. And then as that second coming of the Lord is delayed, it doesn't happen in the time frame that they had in their minds, and Christianity eventually becomes the official religion of the empire in the 4th century. The intensity of this life is impacted. We still see it perhaps carried out in the monastic movement, where you have this kind of intense common life, and that leads us then into the Mendicant movement of the 13th century, where in these high Middle Ages we have these religious orders forming, and they're poor. They intentionally take a vow of poverty to join the poor in their poverty and to care for them. We think of groups like the Franciscans, for example. And we have this understanding that kind of runs through this whole history, that wealth and position call for an exercise of stewardship. That we're called to have a just care for the earth's wealth. And this becomes the basis of charity and justice, that each person is entitled to the amount of wealth necessary to sustain themselves in society. This is impacted with the rise of capitalism and in the years following the Reformation, where the creation of the rise of capitalism shifts the mentality, and wealth is no longer seen as that which is to be stewarded and given to the poor, but becomes a matter of acquisition. Now I acquire as much as I can, as much as will make me happy. So we lose something of that sense of solidarity, perhaps. Now, Catholic social teaching has 4 permanent principles. These are laid out very clearly in the compendium of the social doctrine of the Church. There's a cornerstone, and that would be the dignity of the human person, the worth or value of the concrete existing human being. So each human being has an inherent dignity. The source of this dignity is the Creator, God, in whose image and likeness human beings are. A second principle, the common good. John Paul II, he describes this as the good of all and of each individual. The good of all and each individual, that good that benefits the whole. We're all called to participate in it. And as that common good is pursued and grows, each individual is blessed by it. A third principle, solidarity. This is an awareness of the intrinsic social nature of the human being. The equality in dignity and rights, and also our interdependence, that we depend on one another. And it's also a moral virtue. So on one hand, it's kind of this awareness that we are all brothers and sisters, that there's a common humanity that we're part of, that we depend on one another. So there's an awareness involved, but it's also a moral virtue. It calls for a commitment to the common good, because we do have a responsibility for all, for our brothers and sisters, that we can't just kind of turn a blind eye, for example. The final point, the final permanent principle is subsidiarity. And in this case, we're looking at these various layers or levels of society, that societies of a superior order must adopt attitudes of help. This is where the word comes from, the Latin word subsidium. Therefore, of support, promotion, and development with respect to lower order societies. This has become actually a pretty hot topic during the pandemic. At which points has a higher level of government perhaps overstepped lower levels, so this is what that principle of subsidiarity is getting at, that if the problem can be dealt with at the lowest level, then it should be dealt with at the lowest level. And if it can't, then that's where higher levels can come in and support and provide help. So we get back to Jimmy. These principles would very much aid in how Jimmy's mother would then go about dealing with the situation of little Jimmy at the school, So she has in mind Jimmy's dignity as a human person, as her son, but also the dignity of every student in Jimmy's class, that the dignity of each of these students would be upheld, even the dignity of the bully, and then you move from there to the common good, that the common good of every student must be pursued and upheld. And then, obviously a principle of solidarity, that these are, that these students all have something in common. One is not above the other. This isn't an environment of dominance or things like that. And then obviously subsidiarity, where she would work with the level of authority that's closest to the issue, the teacher first, and then and only then would she move up the ladder to engage higher levels of authority to deal with this issue. All right, a final point. I think it's almost the end. That Catholic social teaching helps us to see and to engage contemporary issues. So the church is really called in every time to scrutinize the signs of the times, to see what's going on in the world, in society. And these principles of Catholic social teaching help us to do that. They help us to see in a certain way. The Christian knows that in the social doctrine of the church can be found the principles for reflection, the criteria for judgment, and the directives for action, which are the starting point for the promotion of an integral and solidary humanism. I love that line. So these principles help me to see and to reflect. They help me to judge what it is that's going on, and then they move me to action. And these principles push us into these different areas. I just started to list some of them here. What's going on in family life? What's happening in the world of work, the dignity of workers' rights, and what's happening with the environment, how we are using or misusing resources, the world of economics, politics, so on and so forth. So the principles become a lens by which we can see, criteria by which we can judge, and then they give us directives for action. And just a point about the mission statement. So obviously, what we've been able to touch on here is that Catholic social teaching is deeply rooted in the intellectual tradition. And then I always tell my students, it can lend something very particular. It's particularly relevant to that last part of the mission statement, their responsibility to others. It can give that shape and give it direction. And that's why it's such an integral part of the curriculum here, and also why it spills out into the life of the community, student life. If you care to do any further study, I would recommend just going straight to the compendium of the social doctrine of the church. It's laid out very nicely, and it's loaded with references to other documents, particularly encyclicals that have been written by the popes in recent years. And so it's a quite handy little resource.